You will never be half the man your stepbrother is. My stepdad sneered across the pristine white tablecloth. I slowly wiped my mouth, stood up, and looked him dead in the eye. Good, I said, my voice cutting through the restaurant chatter. Let him pay your bills then, because I am completely done. My mother froze her fork, clattering against the fine china. What are you talking about? She whispered. We have not seen a single cent from you. And right there, watching my golden boy stepbrother suddenly choke on his expensive whiskey, I realized the ultimate betrayal. The ambient noise of the high-end, downtown Atlanta steakhouse seemed to dial back up as I sat there suffocating in a dark green sequined dress I only wore to keep the peace. We were supposed to be celebrating my mother Sylvia and my stepdad Warren's 15th wedding anniversary. The private dining room was softly lit by crystal chandeliers, casting a warm golden glow over the heavy mahogany table and the array of half-eaten prime steaks and empty wine bottles. It was a beautiful evening on the surface, but underneath it was just another performance. I was once again the captive audience to the Jamal show. Jamal, my stepbrother, sat directly across from me, radiating the kind of unearned arrogance that only comes from a lifetime of being told you are flawless. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit that likely cost more than my first delivery truck. Next to him sat his wife Lauren, a white woman from a wealthy suburban family who treated every family gathering like a charity mission where she was the benevolent savior observing our dynamics. Lauren was currently swirling a glass of vintage champagne, the diamonds on her tennis bracelet catching the chandelier light as she laughed a little too loudly at a joke Warren had just made. My mother, Sylvia, sat beside Warren, her posture rigid, her smile perfectly fixed. She had spent the last 15 years bending over backward to ensure Warren and his biological son felt like the absolute center of the universe. In the process, she had willingly allowed me, her own daughter, to be pushed to the margins. This dinner was a microcosm of my entire existence. Jamal received the glory, Lauren received the privilege, and I received the disrespect. Warren tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon, the sharp ringing sound demanding absolute silence from the table. He stood up, smoothing the lapels of his charcoal suit, and cleared his throat. I expected him to look at my mother to say something kind about their 15 years of marriage or the life they had built together. Instead, his eyes immediately bypassed his wife and locked onto his son. I want to propose a toast, Warren boomed, his deep voice carrying an undeniable edge of pride. Not just to 15 years of marriage, but to the legacy we are building. I look across this table, and I see my son Jamal, a financial genius, a man who took a small investment firm and turned it into an empire. You are the absolute pillar of Black excellence in this family, son. You have shown what it means to lead, to provide, and to carry the family name with honor. Jamal leaned back in his chair, soaking up the praise like a sponge. He raised his glass to his father, offering a smug smile. Lauren beamed, leaning her head on Jamal's shoulder and shooting a triumphant look around the table, as if her husband's supposed accomplishments were her own personal victory. Warren was not finished. He took a sip of his wine, and then his gaze shifted slowly to me. The warmth in his eyes vanished instantly, replaced by the familiar cold condescension I had endured since I was 20 years old. He let out a heavy, dramatic sigh before speaking again. And then we have Kendra, Warren said, shaking his head slightly. You know, I look at you, and I just do not understand it. You had the opportunity to be a lawyer. You had the chance to do something respectable. But here you are, 35 years old, and still playing around with trucks and boxes. You will never be half the man your stepbrother is, Kendra. You lack his vision and his drive. Maybe one day, you will figure out how to build real wealth, instead of just moving other people's belongings around like a glorified delivery driver. The sheer disrespect of his words hit me like a physical blow. He was talking about my supply chain logistics firm, a company I had built from absolutely nothing. A company that now operated a fleet of vehicles and managed distribution for major regional suppliers. But to Warren and to my mother, I was just a blue-collar disappointment who had thrown away a law degree. They did not know the reality of my success because they had never bothered to ask, and I had stopped trying to prove myself to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. Lauren hid a small, mocking laugh behind her champagne flute. She leaned over the table, her floral perfume suffocatingly sweet, and whispered to me with dripping condescension, "You really should not be so intimidated by generational wealth, Kendra. Some people are just built for high finance, and some people are built for manual labor. There is no shame in being exactly where you are. Just be proud of Jamal." I turned my eyes to my mother, hoping that just this once she might defend me. She might tell her husband that his words were cruel, or tell her daughter-in-law to mind her own business. Instead, Sylvia reached over and patted Warren's arm affectionately. She shot me a sharp warning glare and actually mouthed the words, "Do not ruin this for us." That was the moment the final thread snapped. For 4 years, I had been the silent financial backbone of this family. When Warren's contracting business took a hit and my mother was diagnosed with a heart condition, I had stepped up without hesitation. I had set up a recurring wire transfer of $5,000 every single month to a family care trust account managed by Jamal. It was supposed to cover their mortgage payments and my mother's expensive medical bills. I had given up vacations, I had worked 18-hour days, and I had sacrificed my own peace of mind to ensure they never lost their home. I had done it quietly because Jamal insisted Warren was too proud to accept money directly from his stepdaughter. I had trusted my stepbrother to handle the logistics while taking all the public credit for keeping the family afloat. I did not cry. I did not scream. The anger that washed over me was entirely cold and calculating. I calmly picked up my linen napkin, wiped the corner of my mouth, and dropped the cloth directly onto my half-eaten steak. I stood up. I pushed my chair back and the heavy wood scraped loudly against the polished floor. The sound was harsh enough to slice through the soft music and the murmurs of the surrounding tables. Warren stopped talking, his brow furrowing in irritation at the interruption. Lauren rolled her eyes dramatically. Sylvia gasped, her hands fluttering to her chest in a panic over the impending breach of social etiquette. "Good," I said, my voice steady, perfectly modulated, and carrying an undeniable weight of absolute finality. "Let him pay your bills then, because I am completely done." Sylvia's practiced smile vanished instantly. She froze, staring at me as if I had suddenly spoken a foreign language. Her fork slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered loudly against her fine china plate. "What are you talking about, Kendra?" she asked, her voice tight with a mixture of confusion and profound embarrassment. "We have not seen a single cent from you since you dropped out of law school. Jamal has been paying for everything." The restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath. Across the table, Jamal suddenly started coughing violently. He choked on his expensive whiskey, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. His eyes darted frantically toward the exit, the smug arrogance entirely wiped from his features. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking pale and terrified. I looked at Jamal gripping the edge of the table as he struggled to breathe, and the horrific truth of the last 4 years slammed into me with the force of a freight train. The silence that followed my mother's declaration was heavier than any shout or scream could ever be. I stood there looking down at the people who had made me feel so incredibly small for so long. The $240,000 I had diligently wired over the last 48 months had never reached my parents. Jamal had stood at family dinners accepting praise for his financial generosity, while quietly pocketing the money I had sacrificed my own comfort to provide. I had let them belittle me, knowing full well that my so-called trucks and boxes were the only things keeping a roof over their heads. I stared at my mother, whose eyes were wide with genuine bewilderment, and then at Warren, whose arrogant sneer was slowly faltering into an expression of deep, unsettling confusion. I was done being the family scapegoat. I was done being the punching bag for their insecurities. The era of my silence was over and the reckoning was just beginning. I unlocked the screen of my phone and opened my corporate banking app, navigating straight to the recurring transfers page. The bright white screen illuminated the space between us as I slid the phone firmly across the pristine tablecloth directly toward my mother. $5,000 a month, Sylvia. I said, my voice steady and cold. For the last 4 years. Wired directly into the family care trust Jamal set up to cover your mortgage and your expensive medical bills. Sylvia stared at the screen, her eyes tracing the unmistakable lines of digital receipts, $240,000 total. Before she could even process the massive number, Jamal lunged across the wide mahogany table. He scrambled frantically, trying to snatch the phone from in front of her. His sudden violent movement knocked over a crystal water goblet, sending ice and cold water cascading directly into Lauren's lap. Lauren shrieked, jumping up and swatting furiously at her designer silk dress. "Kendra, this is a massive misunderstanding." Jamal stammered, his chest heaving as he gripped the edge of the table. "You do not understand how high-level finance works. It is corporate restructuring. The funds are tied up in investment lockup periods to generate maximum yield for the estate. You are just looking at a snapshot of a diversified portfolio." I looked at him with absolute unvarnished disgust. "Yield for the estate, Jamal?" I asked. "You told me the bank was threatening foreclosure 4 years ago, and that Warren was too proud to take charity from his stepdaughter. You swore you were managing my money to keep a roof over their heads. I am looking at a zero balance on a mortgage account while you wear a custom suit funded by my labor." Lauren immediately weaponized her tears. Her face crumpled into a mask of pure victimhood as she dabbed at her wet dress with a linen napkin. "Why are you doing this?" she cried loudly enough for the surrounding tables to turn and stare. "You are just an angry, bitter woman trying to humiliate my successful husband in public. You have always been so jealous of what we have built. You are attacking a successful black man because you are intimidated by our lifestyle, and you want a handout." Jealous of what? I shot back. "The luxury lifestyle my money is apparently funding." I expected Warren to explode at his biological son. I expected my mother to demand immediate answers, to ask Jamal where exactly $250,000 had gone, if not to her medical providers and the bank. Instead, Warren slammed his heavy fist onto the table, violently rattling the expensive silverware. "Lower your voice right now," Kendra Warren hissed, leaning forward with his teeth bared. "You are causing a scene. You are embarrassing us in front of the entire restaurant." "We are not doing this here." Sylvia reached across the table and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly tight, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. "Kendra, stop it," she pleaded, her voice a desperate, frantic whisper. "Jamal is building generational wealth. He has an image to maintain for Lauren's family. You know how hard it is for him in the corporate world. We will handle this privately. Do not ruin this night for your brother. Her family comes from real money, and they will not understand this kind of ghetto behavior." I stared at my mother, completely paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of her defense. She was actively shielding the man who had stolen her financial security just to protect his fragile ego and his standing with his wealthy white in-laws. They did not care about the blatant theft. They only cared about the public optics. It did not matter that I had sacrificed my own peace of mind working 18-hour days to keep them afloat. In their eyes, I was still just the aggressive problem child disrupting their perfect family illusion. I pulled my wrist out of Sylvia's grasp with a sharp jerk. I picked up my phone from the table, casually wiping off a few drops of spilled water from the screen. "I am not ruining anything, Sylvia," I said. "I am just balancing the books." I tapped the screen, dialing the premier service line for my corporate bank. I put the phone on the speakerphone and set it right in the center of the table. A polite customer service representative answered immediately, asking how she could assist me tonight. "Yes," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the tense silence of our table. "I need to permanently revoke a recurring wire transfer authorization. The recipient account is listed under Jamal and the Family Care Trust. Cancel it immediately and flag any future requests from that account as fraudulent." The representative confirmed the cancellation within seconds. I thanked her and ended the call. The satisfying click of the phone hanging up felt like a heavy chain snapping right off my shoulders. Jamal sat completely deflated, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the dark screen of my phone. Lauren was still crying softly, muttering about how unhinged I was, while Warren glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Since Jamal is the financial genius of the family, he can cover the bill tonight," I said, picking up my clutch. I turned my back on them and walked out of the private dining room. I kept my head held high, ignoring the stares of the other patrons and the murmurs rippling through the restaurant. I stepped out into the humid Atlanta night air, hailing a car and leaving them sitting in the ruins of their own deception. The ride back to my house was a blur of streetlights and silent revelations. I watched the city of Atlanta roll past my window, feeling a strange mixture of profound grief and absolute clarity. For years, I had operated under the heavy delusion that if I just worked hard enough, if I provided enough stability, if I became the silent benefactor my family needed, they would eventually see my worth. I had built an entire supply chain logistics empire, from a single leased delivery van to a massive corporate fleet, and yet to them, I was still nothing more than a blue-collar checkbook. They had willingly consumed the fruits of my labor while actively despising the hands that provided them. The betrayal was not just Jamal's theft. It was Sylvia's immediate instinct to protect his fraudulent image over my tangible sacrifice. It was Warren's absolute refusal to hold his biological son accountable while demanding my silent submission. I realized then that toxic families do not have a breaking point, they only have a tipping point, and I had finally reached mine. The next morning, I arrived at my corporate headquarters before the sun had even fully risen over the industrial park. My facility covered over 100,000 square feet of prime commercial real estate buzzing with the organized chaos of morning dispatches. The rumble of diesel engines and the rhythmic beeping of reversing transport trucks usually brought me a deep sense of comfort. It was the sound of my independence, the tangible proof of my capabilities. I employed over 200 drivers, warehouse staff, and logistics coordinators. The irony of Warren calling this playing with boxes was not lost on me. I walked past the loading docks, exchanging nods with my shift supervisors, and made my way up the steel staircase to my corner office. The space was utilitarian, but expansive, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that allowed me to oversee the entire warehouse floor. I brewed a strong cup of black coffee, trying to shake the lingering exhaustion of the previous night's confrontation. I sat behind my heavy oak desk, ready to bury myself in quarterly projection reports and fleet maintenance schedules. I needed the predictable logic of numbers and routing software to cleanse my mind of family drama. My executive assistant knocked softly on the open door, holding a small stack of the morning's mail. She set it on the corner of my desk, mentioning that a certified letter had arrived marked urgent. I thanked her and took a sip of my coffee letting the hot, bitter liquid ground me. I reached for the thick, certified envelope bearing the official seal of a major national bank. The address block caught my eye immediately. It was addressed to my mother, Sylvia, but it had been mistakenly forwarded to my corporate headquarters address instead of my residential one. My business address was listed as the secondary contact on the original trust documents I had signed years ago, but I had never received correspondence here before. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. I carefully tore the perforated edge of the envelope and pulled out the dense stack of legal documents. It was not a routine bank statement or a simple missed payment notification. The bold red lettering at the top of the first page sent a shockwave of ice straight through my veins. It was a formal pre-foreclosure warning. I read the document twice, my mind struggling to process the figures printed on the page. According to the bank notice, my parents' home was over 90 days past due on a massive secondary loan. But it was not the original mortgage I had been sending money to cover. Jamal had not just been pocketing my monthly $5,000 wire transfers to fund his luxury cars and Lauren's designer wardrobe. He had done something infinitely worse. The documents revealed a secondary line of credit extracted against the equity of the house for $300,000. Jamal had forged Sylvia's signature to take out a massive predatory loan, using his own parents' home as collateral to inject liquid cash into his failing investment firm. The house I grew up in, the property I had sacrificed 4 years of my life to protect, was literally weeks away from being seized by the bank. Jamal had drained the family dry and left them standing on a financial sinkhole, and the real shock was that they were entirely blind to the trap closing around them. I stared at the thick stack of bank papers, spreading them across my heavy oak desk. The bold red lettering of the pre-foreclosure notice seemed to burn into my retinas. $300,000. Jamal had not just intercepted my wire transfers. He had systematically drained every single drop of equity out of the home my parents had worked their entire lives to buy. I flipped to the last page of the loan agreement, and there it was. My mother's signature, or rather a clumsy, desperate imitation of it. I knew Sylvia's handwriting intimately. I had watched her sign thousands of permission slips and report cards. The loops and slants on this document were rigid, forced, and undeniably forged. Jamal had committed federal mortgage fraud. He had leveraged his own parents' shelter to keep his failing investment firm afloat and to keep Lauren dripping in diamonds. The sheer sociopathic audacity of it left me completely breathless for a moment. He had sat at that anniversary dinner, soaking up praises for his financial genius, while knowing full well the bank was preparing to throw Warren and Sylvia onto the street. I did not waste time crying. I reached for my desk phone and dialed Jamal's personal cell number. He answered on the second ring. I fully expected him to sound panicked or apologetic. I expected him to beg me to keep the secret. Instead, his voice came through the receiver dripping with the exact same unearned arrogance he had displayed at the steakhouse. Kendra, he sighed, a heavy, condescending sound. Look, I am glad you called. We need to talk about your little outburst last night. You really embarrassed Warren, and you owe Lauren an apology for ruining her dress. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring out the window at my fleet of delivery trucks lined up at the loading docks. I am looking at a pre-foreclosure notice from Vanguard Financial, Jamal, I said, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm. A $300,000 secondary line of credit taken out against the family home, with a spectacularly forged version of Sylvia's signature on the final page. The line went dead silent. For a few seconds, the only sound was the distant hum of traffic outside his downtown office window. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted from condescension to cornered aggression. You do not know what you are looking at, Kendra, he snapped. Real money requires leverage. That is how the system works. I am moving capital around to generate higher yields. You would not understand high-level finance because you run a glorified delivery service. It is a temporary liquidity issue, and it will be resolved by the end of the quarter. A temporary liquidity issue. I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. You stole my money, Jamal, and when that was not enough to fund your fake lifestyle, you committed federal fraud. The bank is going to take their house in less than 45 days. He let out a short, bitter laugh. And what exactly are you going to do about it, Kendra? Are you going to run to Sylvia and show her those papers? You know her heart condition is severe. Her blood pressure spiked just from your little temper tantrum last night. If you drop this on her, the shock will put her in the hospital or worse. Do you want to be responsible for putting your own mother in a hospital bed just to prove you are right? I was using my mother's fragile health as a human shield to protect his crimes. The utter lack of a moral compass was staggering. You have 48 hours to fix this, Jamal, I told him, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Or I am not just going to the family. I am going to the authorities. I hung up the phone before he could respond. I needed to focus on damage control, but I barely had time to process the confrontation before my personal cell phone buzzed on the desk. It was a notification from the family group chat. I opened the message app. Lauren had just sent a massive block of text to the entire extended family, including aunts, uncles, and cousins who had not even been at the dinner. She was executing a preemptive strike, spinning the narrative to protect her husband. I am so heartbroken to even have to write this. Lauren texted, her digital words practically dripping with fake suburban fragility. Jamal and I wanted to keep this private, but Kendra caused a massive scene at Warren and Sylvia's anniversary dinner last night. We know her little trucking gig is failing, and she has been struggling financially, but screaming at Jamal for a handout in public was completely unacceptable. We are praying for her mental health and hoping she finds peace instead of tearing down a successful black man just because she is jealous. I read the message twice, my blood boiling hotter with every word. This white woman, sitting in a mansion funded by my stolen money and my parents' stolen equity, had the absolute nerve to weaponize my race and my business against me. She was actively painting me as the angry, bitter black woman attacking her successful husband to deflect from the fact that they were nothing but common thieves. My phone buzzed again and again as relatives began responding to the group chat, offering Lauren and Jamal their prayers and expressing their deep disappointment in my supposed behavior. I did not type a single word in response. Responding to a smear campaign only gives it oxygen. I simply took a screenshot of the entire thread and filed it away in a secure folder on my desktop. I was gathering my ammunition. I thought the group chat message was the extent of Lauren's retaliation. I underestimated the vindictive reach of a woman protecting her unearned privilege. 30 minutes later, there was a sharp knock on my office door. My director of operations, David, walked in holding a thick stack of manila folders. His usually calm face was tight with worry. "Kendra, we have a massive problem," David said, closing the door heavily behind him. "We just got a call from the City Council procurement office." I sat up straight, pushing the foreclosure documents aside. What happened? "We submitted the final bid for the municipal logistics contract yesterday. Our numbers were bulletproof. This contract was the crown jewel of our quarterly expansion. The city of Atlanta was restructuring its entire municipal supply distribution network. Winning this bid meant a multi-million-dollar injection into my company, securing our dominance in the southeastern region for the next decade. We had the best fleet, the best routing software, and the most competitive pricing model. It was supposed to be a guaranteed win." David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Procurement just flagged our application for an emergency review. They are claiming there is a sudden irregularity in our financial disclosures and union compliance records. They are talking about disqualifying our bid entirely." "That is impossible," I said, standing up and moving around my desk. "We passed the preliminary audit with flying colors. Who flagged it?" David flipped open the folder and pointed to a name on the review committee notice. "Councilman Sterling, the chairman of the procurement board." The name hit me like a physical strike. Councilman Sterling was not just a city official. He was a prominent member of the ultra-exclusive Buckhead Country Club, the exact same country club where Lauren's father served on the executive board. The same father who had funded Lauren's lavish wedding to Jamal and who regularly played golf with the city's elite. Lauren had not stopped at a passive-aggressive text message. She had gone straight to her daddy. She had weaponized her family's generational wealth and societal connections to launch a direct targeted strike against my livelihood. She figured if she could destroy my company, cut off my income, and ruin my professional reputation, I would be too busy surviving to expose Jamal's mortgage fraud. She wanted to crush me so completely that I would have no choice but to crawl back into the shadows and stay quiet. They honestly believed they could break me. They thought because I built my empire with my own two hands instead of inheriting it through a country club membership that I was an easy target. They looked at my warehouses and my trucks and saw vulnerability. They had no idea what kind of war they had just started. "Tell the legal team to clear their schedules," I told David, my voice entirely devoid of panic. "Pull every piece of raw data from our dispatch logs, our union payrolls, and our safety inspections. We are not just going to answer their emergency review. We are going to bury them in so much undeniable compliance data that disqualifying us would trigger a federal discrimination lawsuit." David nodded, the worry in his eyes replaced by a sharp, focused determination. "You got it, boss." As he hurried out of the office, I looked back down at the pre-foreclosure notice sitting on my desk. Jamal and Lauren thought they held all the power because they knew how to manipulate the system and lie to the family. They thought throwing their weight around with city council members would intimidate me. But intimidation only works on people who have something to hide. I had nothing to hide and absolutely everything to protect. I picked up the fraudulent bank documents and locked them safely inside my heavy steel filing cabinet. Lauren wanted to play corporate warfare, and Jamal wanted to play high finance. It was time to show them exactly how a real boss operates. The very next morning, the predictable consequences of my refusal to play along came marching right through my front door. I was standing on the elevated steel catwalk that overlooked the main floor of my logistics facility, holding a clipboard and reviewing the morning dispatch routes with David. The warehouse was a symphony of organized noise. Forklifts beeped in reverse, heavy bay doors rolled open and closed, and dozens of workers moved pallets of freight with practiced precision. Suddenly, the rhythmic flow of my business was violently interrupted by a booming voice shouting over the machinery. "Kendra, where is she? I want to speak to her manager right now." I looked down over the metal railing. Warren was storming across the painted yellow safety lines on the warehouse floor, completely ignoring the high-visibility vest protocol and shoving past a loader holding a clipboard. He was wearing his usual tailored golf polo and slacks, looking entirely out of place amidst the industrial steel and concrete. My receptionist was trailing frantically behind him, holding a visitor badge and telling him he needed an escort. Warren simply waved her off as if she were a nuisance. I handed my clipboard to David and walked slowly down the metal stairs. I did not rush. I let my heavy work boots ring against the steel steps, projecting total authority in my own domain. Warren spotted me halfway down and marched toward the base of the staircase, his face twisted into an ugly mask of righteous indignation. "There you are," he barked, pointing a thick finger up at me. "I have been calling your phone all morning. What is wrong with you causing all this drama and stressing out your mother? You are going to fix this today, Kendra." Jamal is dealing with a temporary liquidity issue because he is making big moves in the market and he needs capital. You are going to the bank today, and you are taking out a personal loan to cover his shortfall. It is your duty to protect your brother's reputation after that stunt you pulled at dinner. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood on the concrete floor, leveling my gaze with his. I looked at this man who had spent 15 years treating me like a second-class citizen in my own family. He actually believed he could walk into my workplace and demand I take on personal debt to fund the golden child's fraudulent lifestyle. "I am not taking out a loan for a thief, Warren," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, but cutting through the noise of the warehouse. "And you are trespassing on a secured commercial property." Warren stepped closer, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me, the way he had when I was 20 years old. "You listen to me, you arrogant little girl," he hissed. "Jamal is building a legacy for this family while you are still pushing boxes around. If you do not go to the bank right now and wire him that money, I am going straight to the head office. I will find whoever runs this facility, and I will tell them exactly what kind of ungrateful, disruptive person they have on their payroll. I will have your wages garnished to pay back the family for everything we spent raising you. I will have you fired by the end of the day." He stood there breathing heavily, completely satisfied with his threat. He honestly believed I was just a middle manager in a company owned by someone else. He thought the glass walls of the corner office upstairs belonged to a boss he could manipulate. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply raised my hand and signaled to Terrence, my head of security, who had been standing quietly 10 feet away, waiting for my command. Terrence, a former Marine who stood 6'4", stepped forward immediately. I looked Warren dead in the eye and delivered the reality check he had desperately needed for 15 years. "I am the boss, Warren." I said, my tone absolute and chillingly calm. "I own the building, I own the trucks, and I own the payroll you are currently standing on. Now get out of my facility before I have you arrested for criminal trespassing." Warren's face went completely slack. The arrogant sneer melted off his features, replaced by a look of profound, staggering shock. He looked up at the expansive warehouse ceiling, taking in the massive scale of the operation. The dozens of commercial trucks lined up outside and the hundreds of employees moving freight. Then he looked back at me, his mouth opening and closing, as he struggled to reconcile the blue-collar disappointment he had fabricated in his mind with the multi-million-dollar CEO standing right in front of him. Terrence placed a heavy, firm hand on Warren's shoulder. "It is time to go, sir," Terrence said, his voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. Warren did not say another word. He turned and let Terrence escort him across the warehouse floor and out the glass front doors, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen him. I did not have time to revel in the victory. The clock was ticking on Lauren's sabotage, and I had a city council to conquer. I walked straight back up the stairs and into my office, where David had assembled the legal and compliance teams. The conference table was covered in thick binders containing every piece of data related to our municipal bid. Lauren thought her father's country club connections could quietly sink my application in a closed-door committee meeting. She assumed I would wait defensively for a rejection letter. She assumed incorrectly. "Grab the boxes," I told my team. "We are not waiting for their emergency review hearing next week. We are going to the municipal building right now." We drove a convoy of black SUVs directly to the Atlanta City Council building. I bypassed the procurement office entirely and requested an immediate emergency audience with the mayor's chief of staff and the city's legal counsel. When they tried to tell me I needed an appointment, I instructed my corporate attorney to politely inform them that if they did not review our compliance data right, That second, we would be filing a massive federal lawsuit against the city for racial discrimination and corrupt bidding practices involving Councilman Sterling. The doors opened very quickly after that. We sat in a large oak-paneled conference room with the highest-ranking officials in the city's procurement division, including Councilman Sterling, who looked incredibly uncomfortable sweating through his expensive tailored suit. He tried to claim that my company had red flags regarding union payroll compliance and financial stability, citing anonymous tips from concerned citizens. I smiled and pushed a 300-page bound audit directly across the table to the Chief of Staff. There are no red flags, I stated smoothly. You are looking at 5 years of flawless union compliance records, spotless safety inspections, and a financial backing that shows we operate with zero high-risk debt. Our bid saves the city $4 million a year while increasing delivery efficiency by 20%. Now I understand Councilman Sterling may have received pressure from certain associates at the Buckhead Country Club to favor a competing vendor, but I assure you, disqualifying the most qualified minority-owned business in the state based on a country club favor will not look good on the evening news. Councilman Sterling turned the color of chalk. The Chief of Staff flipped through our flawless audit, his eyes widening at the undeniable quality of our logistical model. He looked at Sterling, then back at me. He knew exactly what was happening, and he wanted no part of a federal corruption scandal. There is clearly no issue here, the Chief of Staff said, closing the binder definitively. Your bid is immaculate. The emergency review is officially dismissed, and we look forward to finalizing the contract with your firm by Friday. I walked out of the municipal building into the bright Georgia sunshine, having completely crushed Lauren's pathetic attempt to destroy my livelihood. I had just secured a contract that would inject massive capital into my business, elevating my company into an entirely new stratosphere of wealth. But the true victory came later that afternoon, when I sat down with my lead corporate attorney in my office to finalize the background bonding requirements for the new city contract. We needed to prove our liquid asset capabilities, and during that deep dive financial review, my attorney discovered something that stopped the breath in my lungs. Kendra, my attorney said, turning his laptop screen toward me. While we were mapping out our new asset acquisitions, I had the analysts run a quiet sweep on Vanguard financials, current market movements, just to see where the banking sector is leaning. I know you mentioned Vanguard yesterday regarding that fraudulent secondary mortgage your stepbrother took out. I leaned forward, staring at the screen. What did you find? Vanguard is quietly shedding high-risk liabilities to balance their books for the quarter. My attorney explained, tapping a specific line of data. They have bundled a massive portfolio of distressed debt and non-performing commercial loans. They are quietly auctioning it off to private equity buyers by the end of the week to clear their ledgers. I looked closely at the data set, and my heart began to pound with a heavy, rhythmic certainty. The portfolio up for auction included the underwater commercial loans tying up Jamal's failing investment firm. But more importantly, it included the $300,000 secondary mortgage he had fraudulently taken out against my parents' home. If a private equity buyer purchased that portfolio, they would immediately initiate foreclosure proceedings to liquidate the assets and recoup their investment. Warren and Sylvia would be thrown out onto the street by a faceless corporation within a month, and Jamal would be bankrupted entirely, unless I bought it first. I sat back in my chair, my mind calculating the exact amount of capital I had just secured from the municipal contract. Lauren and Jamal had spent the last 4 years treating me like an inferior servant, relying on my stolen money to fund their arrogance. Warren had walked into my building and demanded I take out loans to protect the very man who had robbed his home of its equity. They thought they controlled the board because they played dirty. They had no idea that I was about to buy the entire board out from under them. With the trap fully set, I turned my attention to the weekend ahead. The night before the grand vow renewal, Warren and Sylvia were hosting an intimate pre-party gathering at their house. It was supposed to be a warm family dinner for Lauren's wealthy white relatives who had flown in for the event. I knew it would be nothing more than another stage for Warren to belittle me and praise his golden son, but I needed to be there. I needed to walk into the home I now technically owned and watch them play their roles one last time. I arrived at the house wearing a simple, understated charcoal dress, carrying the leather-bound dossier casually under my arm. The driveway was packed with luxury sedans, and the house was buzzing with laughter and the clinking of wine glasses. I stepped through the front door, and the atmosphere immediately shifted. Warren was holding court in the center of the living room, a glass of expensive bourbon in his hand. He was surrounded by Lauren's father and several of her uncles. As soon as he saw me walk in, his chest puffed out, and his voice grew louder, ensuring everyone in the room could hear him. "Ah, here is our logistics manager," Warren boomed, gesturing toward me with a condescending chuckle. "I was just telling Richard here about your little trucking business, Kendra." I told him it is honest work for people who do not have the mind for corporate strategy. Lauren's father, Richard, chuckled, swirling his wine. "Well, we always need people to deliver the packages, Warren. It keeps the real economy moving." Warren beamed, soaking up the validation from his wealthy white counterpart. "Exactly, Richard. But thankfully we have Jamal to handle the real heavy lifting in this family. Jamal just saved this very estate from a predatory bank trying to force a bad loan on us. The boy is a wizard. He protected our legacy without breaking a sweat." The sheer irony of Warren standing in a foreclosed home, bragging about the son who had secretly stolen its equity to Lauren's father, whose own retirement accounts were currently being embezzled by that same son, was almost too poetic to bear. I did not interrupt him. I did not defend my multi-million-dollar company. I simply walked over to the beverage cart, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and took a seat in a quiet corner of the room, letting them dig the grave as deep as they possibly could. Lauren noticed me sitting quietly and could not resist the opportunity to twist the knife. She sauntered over, holding a plate of hors d'oeuvres, looking me up and down with exaggerated pity. "I am so glad you decided to show up," Kendra, Lauren said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I was worried you might feel out of place with all these successful people. Did you have to budget carefully to afford that dress? I know things must be tight since you rejected Jamal's generous job offer." I took a slow sip of my water, looking directly into her eyes. "The dress fits perfectly, Lauren," I said, my tone mild and unbothered. "And I assure you my budget is exactly where it needs to be." Lauren scoffed, rolling her eyes and walking away to join Jamal, who was busy shaking hands and playing the role of the triumphant self-made billionaire. A few minutes later, Sylvia appeared at my side. She grabbed my arm tightly, pulling me away from the living room and into the quiet of the kitchen. Her face was tense, her eyes darting nervously toward the hallway to ensure no one was watching us. "Kendra, I need you to promise me you will not cause any problems tomorrow," Sylvia whispered fiercely, her grip tightening on my arm. "Jamal is destined for greatness. He is building something incredible with Lauren and her family. You are just surviving. I know it is hard for you to see him succeed while you struggle, but you need to accept your place. Do not embarrass us. Just sit quietly at your table and let your brother shine." I looked at my mother, completely devoid of any remaining emotional attachment. She was so desperate to cling to the illusion of Jamal's perfection that she was willing to crush her own daughter to maintain it. She had chosen her golden child, and she had chosen to protect a lie. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick, sealed black envelope. I had prepared it specifically for this moment. I placed it directly into Sylvia's hands. She looked down at it, confused. "What is this?" she asked, turning the heavy envelope over. "Do not open this until Jamal gives his toast tomorrow at the reception." I told her, my voice echoing with a cold, absolute certainty. "It is my wedding gift to the family. Make sure Warren is standing right next to you when you read it." Sylvia frowned, looking from the envelope back to my face, but the severity in my eyes stopped her from asking any further questions. She slipped the black envelope into her purse, nodding slowly. "I will be perfectly quiet tomorrow, Sylvia," I promised, stepping away from her. "I will just let Jamal do all the talking." The heavy gold-foiled envelope sat in the center of my desk, catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through my office windows. It looked entirely out of place amidst my operational reports and logistical routing schedules. The return address was embossed in elegant cursive, showcasing Jamal and Lauren's spectacular delusion of grandeur. They were drowning in federal scrutiny, their assets were severely underwater, and Jamal had secretly mortgaged my parents' home to the absolute brink of foreclosure. Yet here they were spending thousands of dollars on custom stationery to announce a lavish 5-year vow renewal. I picked up the thick envelope, feeling the weight of the expensive cardstock. I slid my letter opener through the seal and pulled out the invitation. It was a masterclass in pretentious suburban excess, detailing a weekend of events at one of the most exclusive sprawling botanical estates in the city. But it was not the elegant calligraphy or the excessive schedule of events that caught my attention. It was the small neon yellow sticky note aggressively slapped right over the venue details. The handwriting was unmistakably Lauren's, composed of sharp judgmental angles and forceful loops. We expect you to be on your best behavior, Kendra. You are seated at table 14 near the kitchen. Do not embarrass us. I stared at that small square of yellow paper, and a cold, calculated calm washed over me completely. They were inviting me purely to put me in my place. They wanted me in the room solely so they could relegate me to the shadows, making absolutely sure I witnessed their supposed triumph while sitting among the catering staff and the forgotten distant relatives. Lauren wanted to remind me that no matter what I built, I would always be the outcast, the blue-collar stepdaughter who did not belong at the main table. I slowly peeled the sticky note off the pristine cardstock and dropped it into my trash bin. I did not throw the invitation away. I did not call my mother to complain about the disrespect. I simply logged on to their pretentious custom wedding website and proudly submitted my response. I RSVP'd yes to all events. I even made sure to check the box for the premium steak dinner option. If they wanted me in the room, I was going out of my way to be in the room, but I would not be playing the submissive role they had so carefully assigned to me. I spent the next few days meticulously compiling my absolute arsenal. I did not need to yell or argue or cause a scene. I just needed the truth perfectly documented and entirely undeniable. I locked myself in my office after hours working closely with my executive team to assemble a sleek black leather-bound dossier. It felt heavy in my hands, carrying the physical weight of 4 years of lies and manipulation. Inside the leather binder, we placed the complete tracking history of the $240,000 Jamal had stolen from my monthly wire transfers. The digital footprint was flawless, showing exactly how my hard-earned capital went from my corporate accounts into a fake family trust and then vanished directly into Jamal's personal luxury spending. Next, I added the original mortgage documents, showcasing the secondary line of credit Jamal had illegally extracted from Warren and Sylvia's home. I stared at the final page, tracing the clumsy forged signature Jamal had used to steal the equity right out from under his own parents. It was a terrible forgery, stiff and unnatural, proving just how desperate he had been to secure liquid cash. How was willing to leave his mother and father completely homeless just to keep up appearances at the country club. I added a certified appraisal of the property and the final pre-foreclosure warnings, demonstrating exactly how close my parents were to being thrown out onto the street by the predatory bank. But the dossier was not complete without addressing Jamal's professional crimes. My legal team had managed to pull the pending SEC violation notices, detailing his fraudulent liquidity practices and his aggressive embezzlement schemes. He had been quietly moving funds from his wealthy investors, including Lauren's own father, to cover his massive market losses. I arranged the federal audit warnings in chronological order, creating a devastating timeline of a man who was moments away from federal indictment. And finally, as the undeniable crown jewel of the collection, I inserted the official deed of ownership to their distressed debt portfolio. The heavy parchment was formally stamped with my corporate seal. It was the absolute proof that I now legally owned their entire existence. I was their sole creditor. I scheduled a final meeting with my lead corporate attorney on a rainy Thursday morning to review every single page of the dossier. I needed to ensure the documents were completely ironclad, leaving absolutely no room for Jamal's usual manipulative spin or Warren's loud defensive blustering. I sat across from my lawyer in the quiet conference room, watching as he meticulously reviewed the transfer deeds, the forgery analysis, and the SEC filings. He closed the leather binder and looked up at me with a nod of absolute professional certainty. "The paperwork is flawless, Kendra," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "There is no legal loophole he can use to escape this. You hold the debt on the investment firm, you hold the debt on the family estate, and you hold the undeniable proof of his criminal fraud. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool mahogany table. Initiate the formal foreclosure proceedings on Jamal's investment firm and my parents' house. I instructed him, keeping my voice entirely devoid of hesitation. But I need you to time the execution perfectly. I want the final legal notices to take effect on Monday morning, right at the start of the business day. Let them have this one last weekend. Let them put on their expensive suits and drink their vintage champagne and celebrate their kingdom of lies. My attorney nodded, typing the final commands into his secure legal terminal. He authorized the filings with the local courts and the federal oversight boards, locking the entire process into motion. It is done, Kendra, he confirmed, closing his laptop. Come Monday morning, they will wake up to find they have absolutely nothing left. With the trap fully set and locked into place, I turned my attention to the weekend ahead. The night before the grand vow renewal, Warren and Sylvia were hosting an intimate pre-party gathering at their home. I knew it would be nothing more than another theatrical stage for Warren to belittle my accomplishments and praise his golden son, but I needed to be there. I needed to walk into the home I now technically owned and watch my family play their toxic roles one final time. I needed to see them perform their delusions before I brought the entire stage crashing down around them. I prepared for the evening with deliberate care. I chose an elegant, understated charcoal dress that projected absolute authority without being flashy. I wanted to look like the CEO. I was not the struggling daughter they desperately wanted me to be. I pulled my hair back into a sleek professional style and applied minimal makeup. I did not need armor because I was already bulletproof. I picked up the heavy leather-bound dossier from my desk, tucking it casually under my arm as I walked out of my corporate headquarters. My driver was waiting outside, holding the door to my black SUV. I slid into the quiet leather interior, watching the city lights blur past the tinted windows as we navigated the evening traffic toward my parents' suburban neighborhood. The drive gave me time to reflect on the sheer absurdity of the situation. I was heading to a house that was technically mine, to celebrate a marriage that was entirely fraudulent, surrounded by people who viewed me as nothing more than a blue-collar disappointment. For so many years, the thought of attending these family functions would fill me with a suffocating anxiety. But tonight, the anxiety was completely gone, replaced by a profound, chilling peace. I knew exactly who I was, and I knew exactly what I was about to do. I was no longer the victim of their narrative. I was the architect of their downfall. My driver pulled onto my parents' street, and I immediately saw the scale of the gathering. The driveway and the curb were packed with luxury sedans and high-end imported sports cars belonging to Lauren's wealthy family members. The house was brightly lit, buzzing with loud laughter and the clinking of expensive wine glasses spilling out into the warm evening air. I stepped out of the SUV, my heels clicking softly against the pavement. I took a deep breath of the humid Georgia air, feeling the satisfying weight of the dossier secured under my arm. I walked up the manicured front walkway, completely unbothered by the noise and the performative joy radiating from inside. I reached out and turned the brass handle of the front door, stepping inside the foyer, ready to watch the final act of their magnificent delusion unfold. The moment I crossed the threshold, the heavy scent of expensive floral arrangements and catered hors d'oeuvres hit me. The foyer of my parents' house was completely transformed. Sylvia had clearly hired a high-end design team to mask the fact that they were a month away from total financial ruin. White lilies cascaded down the sweeping staircase, and a string trio played softly in the formal dining room. It was a masterclass in suburban deception. I walked slowly down the hallway, my heels sinking into the plush runner rug. The house was vibrating with the loud, confident chatter of Lauren's wealthy white relatives. They had flown down from Connecticut and New York, treating this Southern vow renewal like a destination gala. I could hear their voices echoing off the vaulted ceilings, praising the architecture and the artwork Sylvia had spent decades collecting. I stepped into the sunken living room, and the dynamic was immediately clear. Warren was standing right in the center of the room, holding court, exactly as I knew he would. He held a heavy crystal glass of scotch in one hand, while his other hand rested firmly on the shoulder of Lauren's father, Richard. Richard was a man who reeked of generational country club money, wearing a tailored blazer and a relaxed but arrogant smile. I stayed near the arched entryway, letting the shadows conceal me for a moment. I wanted to hear exactly what story Warren was selling to his wealthy in-laws. It takes a special kind of mind to navigate this current market. Warren boomed, his voice carrying easily over the polite chatter of the room. I was just telling Richard here about the difference between real corporate strategy and basic labor. Take my stepdaughter Kendra, for example. She means well, she really does. But she runs a little trucking business, moving boxes from point A to point B. It is honest work for people who do not have the head for complex finance. Richard chuckled, swirling the ice in his drink. Well, we always need people to deliver the packages, Warren. It keeps the real economy moving. Somebody has to do the heavy lifting while the rest of us manage the assets. Warren beamed, soaking up the validation from a man he desperately wanted to impress. Exactly, Richard. But thankfully, we have Jamal to handle the actual wealth building in this family. I do not mind telling you, Jamal just saved this very estate from a predatory bank. We had a minor issue with a bad loan. Some aggressive lender tried to force a foreclosure to steal our equity, but Jamal stepped in. The boy is an absolute wizard. He restructured the debt, protected our legacy, and secured the property without breaking a sweat. The sheer irony of his statement was almost too heavy to process. Warren was standing in a home that I currently owned, bragging about the son who had secretly stolen its equity, and he was boasting to a man whose own retirement accounts were actively being embezzled by that very same son. It was a spectacular triangle of absolute fraud. I did not interrupt him. I did not step forward to defend my multi-million-dollar logistics empire. I simply walked over to the temporary bar that had been set up near the bay windows. I asked the bartender for a glass of sparkling water with lime. I took a slow sip, feeling the cool liquid soothe my throat. I was content to let Warren dig his grave as deep as he possibly could. But my quiet observation was quickly interrupted. Lauren had spotted me from across the room. She navigated through the crowd of her relatives holding a small plate of catered appetizers. She was wearing a custom silk dress that likely cost 5 times my parents' monthly mortgage payment. A payment they were not making. Lauren stopped right next to me, looking me up and down with an exaggerated expression of deep pity. "I am so glad you decided to show up," Kendra Lauren said, her voice dripping with fake sugary sweetness. "I was honestly worried you might feel a bit out of place tonight with all these successful people around. I know your family dynamic has been tense lately." I kept my eyes forward, watching the crowd. "I am perfectly comfortable, Lauren." She sighed, shifting her weight and leaning in closer. Her floral perfume was sharp and overwhelming. "Did you have to budget carefully to afford that dress?" she asked, her tone dropping into a mock whisper. "I know things must be extremely tight for you since you rejected Jamal's generous job offer. He really wanted to help elevate you out of your current situation. Give you a taste of the corporate world. It is such a shame you let your pride get in the way of a steady paycheck." I turned my head and looked directly into her eyes. I did not blink. I did not show a single ounce of intimidation. "The dress fits perfectly, Lauren," I said, my tone mild and entirely unbothered. "And I assure you my budget is exactly where it needs to be. You should probably spend less time worrying about my finances and more time looking at your husband's balance sheets." Lauren scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes. She clearly thought I was just throwing out a petty insult. "You are always so defensive, Kendra. It must be exhausting being so bitter all the time. Just try to smile tomorrow." She turned on her and walked away to join Jamal, who was busy shaking hands with her uncles, playing the role of the triumphant self-made billionaire. I watched them interact, completely fascinated by their delusion. They were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship. A few minutes later, my mother appeared at my side. Sylvia did not offer a greeting. She did not ask how I was doing. She simply grabbed my upper arm, her fingers digging into my skin with surprising force. "Come with me right now," Sylvia whispered fiercely. She pulled me away from the living room, navigating through the crowd until we reached the quiet isolation of the kitchen. The catering staff had momentarily stepped out, leaving us completely alone among the stainless steel appliances and the trays of prepared food. Sylvia released my arm and turned to face me. Her face was tight with stress, and her eyes darted nervously toward the hallway to ensure no one was watching us. Kendra, I need you to promise me you will not cause any problems tomorrow. Sylvia demanded, her voice a desperate, harsh whisper. I saw you talking to Lauren. I saw the look on your face. You need to drop this attitude immediately. I smoothed the fabric of my dress where she had grabbed me. I was just having a polite conversation with my sister-in-law, Sylvia. Do not play games with me, Sylvia snapped, stepping closer. Jamal is destined for greatness. He is building something incredible with Lauren and her family. They are opening doors for us that we never could have opened on our own. You are just surviving, Kendra. I know it is hard for you to see him succeed so brilliantly while you struggle with your delivery trucks. But you need to accept your place in this family. Do not embarrass us in front of these people. Just sit quietly at your table and let your brother shine. I looked at my mother and felt the very last ember of my childhood attachment burn out completely. She was standing in a house that was legally mine, wearing jewelry funded by money Jamal had stolen from me. She was so desperately eager to cling to the illusion of Jamal's perfection that she was willing to crush her own daughter to maintain it. She had chosen her golden child over reality. She had chosen to protect a lie. I did not argue with her. I did not try to explain that I was the one who had kept a roof over her head for 4 years. I did not mention the forged mortgage documents, safely locked inside my corporate office. Explaining the truth to someone who is committed to a delusion is a waste of breath. Instead, I reached into my leather bag. My fingers brushed against the thick, sealed black envelope I had prepared specifically for this exact moment. I pulled it out and held it up. The dark, heavy cardstock contrasted sharply against the bright white kitchen lights. I placed the envelope directly into Sylvia's hands. She looked down at it, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What is this?" she asked, turning the heavy black envelope over. There was no writing on the outside, just a smooth wax seal on the back. "Do not open this until Jamal gives his toast tomorrow at the reception," I told her. My voice echoed in the quiet kitchen, carrying a cold, absolute certainty. "It is my wedding gift to the family. Make sure Warren is standing right next to you when you read it." Sylvia frowned, looking from the dark envelope back up to my face. The severity in my eyes stopped her from asking any further questions. She could sense the weight of the moment, even if she could not comprehend what was inside. She slowly slipped the black envelope into her designer purse, nodding with hesitant agreement. "I will be perfectly quiet tomorrow." "Sylvia," I promised, taking a step backward toward the hallway. "I will not cause a single scene during the ceremony. I will just sit at my table in the back and let Jamal do all the talking." I turned around and walked out of the kitchen, leaving my mother alone with the envelope that held the absolute destruction of her entire world. I navigated my way through the crowded living room, slipping past Warren and Richard's loud conversation, and walked out the front door. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped onto the driveway. The stage was perfectly set. The actors were all in their places, holding tightly to their fabricated scripts. All that was left was for the sun to rise on the day of the vow renewal, so I could finally pull the curtain down. The morning of the vow renewal dawned bright and unseasonably warm. I woke up in my own bed, remarkably rested. There was no anxiety tightening my chest, no lingering dread about spending the day surrounded by people who actively despised me. I drank my coffee, reviewed my corporate routing metrics for the upcoming week, and dressed with the precision of a soldier preparing for a final flawless campaign. The sprawling botanical estate Lauren had selected for the event was located 45 minutes outside the city limits. It was a massive historic property, famous for its manicured terraced gardens and towering glass conservatories. When my driver pulled through the wrought iron security gates, the sheer sickening opulence of the spectacle hit me immediately. Valets in crisp white uniforms rushed to open doors for a steady stream of high society guests. Women in pastel designer gowns and men in tailored summer suits strolled along the cobblestone paths, sipping craft cocktails. They had transformed the main conservatory into a reception hall that looked like it belonged in a royal palace rather than a suburban Atlanta suburb. I stepped out of my car and walked toward the massive glass structure. Inside, the air was heavily perfumed with thousands of imported white orchids. Two massive ice sculptures, intricately carved to resemble swans, flanked the entrance, slowly melting under the warm glow of string lights. A live jazz band played smooth, upbeat melodies on a raised wooden stage. Waiters in black ties circulated carrying silver trays loaded with caviar and vintage champagne. It was a breathtaking display of extreme wealth, and every single flower, every drop of champagne, every note played by the jazz band was funded by federal mortgage fraud and stolen capital. I found the seating chart elegantly displayed on a massive gilded mirror near the entrance. I traced my finger down the list of names, moving past the VIP tables, the family tables, and the prominent business associates. There at the very bottom, written in small cursive script, was my name, Table 14. I navigated through the sea of perfectly decorated round tables, moving further and further away from the grand head table where Jamal and Lauren would sit. I kept walking until I hit the absolute back wall of the conservatory. Table 14 was wedged tightly into a dark corner, positioned directly next to the heavy swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. I pulled out my chair and sat down. The placement was designed to be the ultimate insult. Every few minutes, a waiter would push through the doors, letting out a blast of hot air and the loud, clattering sounds of washing dishes. I was seated with a few of Lauren's distant elderly cousins who barely acknowledged my presence, and a couple of Jamal's low-level office assistants who looked terrified to even be there. Lauren had positioned me here so I would be invisible. She wanted me to watch her spectacular triumph from the absolute lowest vantage point possible. She wanted me to feel the full weight of my supposed inferiority. I took a sip from my water glass and smiled. I actually loved the seat. It gave me a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire room. I could see all the moving pieces. I could see the exits. I could see Warren working the crowd, and I could see my mother sitting rigidly at the front table, clutching her designer purse tightly in her lap. She had not let go of it since last night. The afternoon flowed into evening. The elaborate five-course dinner was served and cleared. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a deep twilight blue through the glass ceiling of the conservatory. The jazz band transitioned into soft instrumental background music, signaling that the time for speeches had arrived. The room grew quiet as the clinking of silverware faded. Warren stood up from the head table, tapping his crystal champagne flute. He walked over to the microphone stand positioned in the center of the dance floor, his chest puffed out with absolute pride. The spotlight hit him, illuminating his expensive tuxedo. "Thank you all for joining us tonight," Warren began, his deep voice echoing through the massive glass room. "When I look around this beautiful estate, I am overwhelmed with gratitude. But mostly I am overwhelmed with pride for the man sitting right here." Warren gestured broadly toward Jamal, who was leaning back in his chair holding Lauren's hand and soaking up the adoration. Warren placed a hand over his heart, his eyes shining with performative, unshed tears. "A father only ever wants his son to be a good man." Warren continued, his voice thick with fake emotion. "But Jamal, you are so much more than a good man. You are a titan. You have built an incredible business from the ground up through sheer determination and absolute integrity. You lead with a moral compass that inspires everyone around you. In a world full of shortcuts, you have always taken the high road. You are a protector, a provider, and the truest son a man could ever ask for. I am so deeply honored to call you my boy." The room erupted into applause. Lauren's wealthy relatives nodded approvingly, raising their glasses. Sylvia wiped a tear from her cheek, beaming with maternal pride. I sat in the dark corner by the kitchen doors, perfectly still. Hearing a man praise the absolute integrity of a son who had literally stolen his own parents' home out from under them was a level of psychological delusion that belonged in a medical textbook. The applause died down as Warren handed the microphone directly to Jamal. Jamal stood up, smoothing his tailored jacket. He picked up his glass of vintage champagne and stepped into the spotlight. He looked out over the crowd, his chest broad, his posture screaming arrogance. "Thank you, Dad," Jamal said, his voice smooth and practiced. "And thank you to everyone who flew in to celebrate with Lauren and me today. Building an empire is not easy. It takes vision. It takes sacrifice. It takes a relentless commitment to excellence." Jamal began pacing slowly across the dance floor. He was treating this vow renewal like a corporate keynote address. When I started my firm, people told me I was dreaming too big. Jamal continued, projecting his voice to reach the very back of the room. I faced obstacles from every direction. I even faced haters within my own circle. People who lacked the capacity to understand real wealth building. People who wanted to drag me down to their level just because they were too bitter to elevate themselves. As he spoke those words, Jamal's eyes scanned the room and locked directly onto me, sitting in the shadows of table 14. He stared right at me, a smug, victorious sneer playing on his lips. He was using his moment in the sun to publicly humiliate me one final time. He thought he had completely won. He thought he had successfully stolen my money, defrauded his parents, secured Lauren's wealth, and pushed me into permanent submission. But I stand here today, surrounded by true success, Jamal declared, raising his glass higher still, maintaining eye contact with me. Because God protects the righteous. God rewards those who put in the work. So here's to 5 years of beautiful marriage to Lauren and to a lifetime of generational wealth. The crowd broke into massive applause. People stood up from their chairs, cheering and clapping. Lauren walked over to Jamal, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him dramatically for the photographer standing nearby. I did not clap. I did not raise my glass. I stood up. I pushed my heavy wooden chair back against the marble floor. I did not do it softly. The loud, harsh scrape of the wood against the stone cut through the tail end of the applause like a sudden gunshot. Several people near the back turned to look at me. The elderly cousins at my table stopped clapping, staring up at me in confusion. I stepped away from the table and walked out of the shadows. I did not yell. I did not rush. I projected my voice from my diaphragm, using the same calm, commanding tone I used to direct 200 warehouse employees over the roar of diesel engines. It was a voice that demanded absolute obedience. "Sylvia," I said. My voice sliced right through the lingering cheers. It echoed off the glass walls of the conservatory, hitting the head table with perfect clarity. The remaining applause died instantly. The room went completely, entirely silent. Hundreds of high society guests froze, turning their heads to look at the woman standing in the back by the kitchen doors. Jamal lowered his champagne glass, his smug smile faltering. Lauren stopped posing for the photographer, her eyes narrowing in sudden fury. Warren gripped the edge of his table, his face turning a deep shade of red as he realized I was actually speaking. "Sylvia," I said again, my tone carrying a penetrating, terrifying calm. "Open the envelope." The silence hung over the grand conservatory, heavy and suffocating like a thick winter blanket. Sylvia stared at me from the distant head table, her hands trembling violently as they hovered over her designer clutch. She looked completely terrified, caught between the commanding authority in my voice and the desperate need to maintain her perfect societal illusion in front of hundreds of wealthy guests. "Open the envelope," I commanded again, my voice completely unwavering, slicing right through the quiet room. Warren looked down at his wife, his face flushed with a mixture of sudden anger and deep, unsettling confusion. He reached out a heavy hand, attempting to stop her, but Sylvia was already pulling the thick black cardstock from the depths of her purse. Her manicured fingers shook so badly she could barely break the smooth wax seal. I watched her pull out the folded legal documents. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, watching this strange, unexpected intermission. It took only a few excruciating seconds for her brain to process the bold red lettering of the official notice of eviction and the certified copy of the true deed to her home. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking gray, hollow, and entirely broken. The vintage champagne glass she had been gripping in her other hand slipped from her numb fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, loud crash, sending shattered crystal and expensive liquor flying across the stone. Warren jumped back, cursing loudly as the glass and alcohol sprayed against the cuffs of his tailored trousers. "What is wrong with you?" Sylvia Warren demanded, snatching the papers directly from her trembling hands. He looked down at the documents and his jaw practically unhinged. His eyes darted across the pages, absorbing the brutal reality of the foreclosure notice. I did not wait for his reaction to fully materialize into words. I stepped away from the shadows of table 14 and began my slow, deliberate walk down the center aisle of the grand conservatory. The hundreds of high society guests parted, automatically pulling their chairs in and holding their breath as I moved past them. The silence was so absolute that the only sound in the massive room was the steady, confident click of my heels against the marble floor. I did not look at the melting ice sculptures or the terrified catering staff who had frozen by the swinging doors. I kept my eyes locked directly on the head table. Jamal stood completely paralyzed behind his microphone, his smug, victorious smile entirely obliterated. He looked like a man watching a tidal wave approach, knowing he was permanently chained to the shore. A bead of sweat rolled down his forehead, catching the bright glare of the spotlight. Lauren stood next to him, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure indignation as she realized I was intentionally destroying their perfect cinematic moment. I reached the head table, but I did not stop in front of Jamal or my mother. I walked deliberately past them and stopped directly in front of Lauren's father, Richard. Richard looked up at me, his brow furrowed in severe displeasure. He was a man accustomed to absolute control, to golf course handshakes and quiet corporate maneuvers. My public disruption was a direct offense to his perfectly orchestrated evening. I reached under my arm and placed the heavy leather-bound dossier firmly onto the white linen tablecloth right next to his pristine dinner plate. "Since we are celebrating Jamal's absolute financial genius tonight," I announced, turning my body slightly so that my voice carried out to the silent crowd of wealthy onlookers. I thought everyone in this room should see exactly how he funded this spectacular party. I pointed down at the thick leather binder. "Inside that dossier, you will find the complete, flawless digital tracking history showing how Jamal spent the last 4 years systematically stealing $250,000 from his own sister." A collective sharp gasp rippled through the conservatory. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, their eyes wide with shock. Murmurs began to break out among the country club elite. "But that is just his pocket change." I continued smoothly, turning my gaze back to Richard, ensuring he felt the full weight of my words. "He also committed federal mortgage fraud against his own parents, forging his mother's signature to extract $300,000 of equity from their home just to keep his failing investment firm afloat. The house they are currently sleeping in is being foreclosed on, and they have absolutely nothing left." The revelation dropped like a live grenade onto the head table. Warren let out a strangled sound, looking from the documents in his hand to his son, his eyes wide with horrified realization. Sylvia covered her mouth with both hands, a silent sob racking her shoulders. The pristine image they had spent 15 years building was disintegrating in real time. Richard stared down at the dossier, his expression hardening as he reached out to open the leather cover. He flipped to the first page, seeing the undeniable banking records and the forged mortgage signatures bearing the official county seals. Jamal finally snapped out of his paralysis. The sheer panic overrode his shock. He lunged across the table, grabbing the microphone stand with sweaty, desperate hands. "She is lying," Jamal shouted, his voice cracking as it echoed harshly through the venue speakers. "Do not listen to a single word she says. She is a jealous, unstable woman who has hated me my entire life because she could never achieve what I have built. She fabricated those documents. It is all a lie. She runs a delivery company. She does not know anything about finance. She is just trying to humiliate me because she is bitter." Lauren shrieked, her face turning an ugly, blotchy red. The facade of the fragile suburban princess vanished, completely replaced by pure, vicious entitlement. She grabbed her heavy silk skirts and marched around the head table, pointing a shaking, perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "Get out of my vow renewal, you pathetic, bitter woman," Lauren screamed, her voice piercing the silent room. "You are ruining the most important day of my life. You have no right to be here spewing these lies about my husband." She spun around, scanning the room frantically, until she spotted the venue security guard standing near the garden exits. "Security!" Lauren shrieked, gesturing wildly toward me. "Remove this woman from the premises immediately. She is trespassing. Throw her out right now before I have her arrested." 2 large security guards in dark suits stepped forward, immediately responding to the screaming bride. They placed their hands on their radios, moving quickly across the marble floor toward the head table to do their jobs and remove the disruption. The guests watched in stunned fascination, expecting me to be dragged out of the conservatory in disgrace. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood my ground looking at the approaching guards with absolute calm authority. Security works for the venue. I said, my voice dropping into a deadly even register that made the guards freeze in their tracks. They looked at me uncertain, confused by my complete lack of fear. I turned my attention back to Jamal, who was hyperventilating behind the microphone, his knuckles white as he gripped the stand. And as of yesterday, my blind trust owns the distressed debt on this venue too, I announced, the truth ringing out with devastating clarity. I watched the realization hit Jamal like a physical, brutal blow to the chest. He staggered back slightly, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The arrogant self-proclaimed titan of finance was reduced to a trembling fraud in front of hundreds of people. The illusion he had spent years crafting was shattered into pieces that could never be reassembled. The guests began whispering loudly, pointing at the golden child, who had just been exposed as nothing more than a common thief. "I am the faceless corporate angel you have been bragging about, Jamal," I said, a cold, hard smile finally touching my lips. "I own your parents' mortgage. I own your failing investment firm. I own the ground you are currently standing on. And I am foreclosing on absolutely everything effective Monday morning." The absolute magnitude of his destruction finally settled over the room. There was no defense he could mount, no corporate jargon he could use to spin his way out of the trap I had flawlessly executed. I stood in the center of the grand botanical estate, completely in control, watching the very people who had belittled my existence realize that I held their entire future in the palm of my hand. Richard did not say a single word as he opened the heavy black leather cover of the dossier. The ambient noise in the massive glass conservatory remained completely muted as every single guest watched the powerful patriarch of this wealthy suburban family examine the evidence I had provided. His blazer hung heavier on his shoulders as his eyes darted across the first few pages. He barely even glanced at the forged residential mortgage documents that had just doomed my parents to imminent homelessness. His intense focus was entirely analytical, as a wealthy man desperately looking for the bottom line that affected him. Then he reached the back section of the thick binder. He reached the pending federal violation notices and the internal audit reports I had acquired during the distressed debt transfer. I watched his face. His arrogant demeanor vanished in a matter of seconds. The healthy vacation tan of his complexion morphed into an alarming deep shade of purple. His hands, previously steady as a veteran surgeon, began to shake so violently that the thick parchment pages rattled audibly against the white linen tablecloth. Richard was not just reading about Jamal's failed boutique investment firm. He was reading the specific account routing numbers detailed in the active federal investigation. I was looking at the undeniable printed proof that Jamal had not just stolen from his blue-collar stepsister or his naive working-class parents. Jamal had used his marriage to Lauren as a financial Trojan horse. He had systematically embezzled millions of dollars directly from his own father-in-law's private retirement accounts to float his rapidly sinking corporate ship. Richard slammed the dossier shut with a force that made the remaining silver cutlery jump and clatter. The sharp, aggressive crack echoed like gunfire in the silent room, breaking the spell that held the hundreds of guests captive. "You absolute son of a bitch!" Richard roared, his voice tearing through the delicate floral atmosphere of the botanical estate with unchecked fury. "You worthless, opportunistic thief!" Jamal stumbled backward away from the microphone, his hands raised in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. "Richard, please listen to me," Jamal begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, frantic whine that completely stripped him of his crafted dignity. "I can explain the market fluctuations. It is just a temporary corporate restructuring. The capital is completely safe, I swear to you on my life. I just needed to leverage the assets for a short-term yield." Richard did not wait for the pathetic excuse to finish. He grabbed his half-full glass of expensive aged scotch from the table and hurled the amber liquid directly into Jamal's face. The heavy ice cubes struck Jamal's cheekbone, and the dark alcohol dripped down his custom-tailored tuxedo, entirely ruining the immaculate silk lapels he had paraded around in all night. "You stole my retirement fund!" Richard screamed, pointing a trembling, aggressive finger at the dripping, cowering fraud standing before him. "You drained my offshore accounts to cover your pathetic amateur gambling on the market. I will see you rot in federal prison before the week is over. I am calling my lawyers right now, and you are going to leave this botanical estate in handcuffs, you miserable parasite. The absolute chaos broke the remaining silence, holding the room hostage. Lauren's wealthy relatives erupted into a frenzy of panicked shouting and aggressive, frantic movement. Uncles and cousins pulled out their cell phones, desperately dialing their own financial advisors, in the middle of the reception, terrified that the golden boy had touched their investment portfolios too. Lauren stood frozen next to the melting swan ice sculptures, her mouth hanging open as she looked from her furious, red-faced father to her soaking wet, trembling husband. The brutal reality of her situation hit her with staggering force. Her entire lavish lifestyle, her custom designer gowns, the massive diamond tennis bracelet currently sparkling on her wrist, the elite country club memberships she flaunted, everything was a complete and utter fraud. It was all funded by stolen money, and now her own flesh and blood was calling the authorities to have her husband locked away. Lauren let out a visceral, blood-curdling shriek that pierced the ears of everyone in the room. She did not direct her fury at me anymore. She turned entirely on the man she had just renewed her sacred vows with. She launched herself at Jamal, her perfectly manicured hands curling into tight, violent fists. She began hitting him frantically, striking his chest and his shoulders with wild, hysterical blows. "You ruined my life," Lauren screamed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her flawless, expensive makeup. "You lied to me every single day. You made me look like an absolute fool in front of my entire family. You are a criminal, and you destroyed everything." Jamal tried to grab her wrists to stop the physical assault, stumbling backward and knocking over a tray of champagne flutes. The beautiful, elegant, high society reception had devolved into a spectacular, violent public brawl. While the wealthy in-laws physically and verbally tore Jamal apart, I slowly shifted my gaze back to the head table. I wanted to see the exact moment the delusion finally broke for the two people who had aggressively enabled this monster for 15 years. Warren was still holding the forged secondary residential mortgage documents I had forced Sylvia to open just moments earlier. The big, booming, confident man who had stood at the microphone just 10 minutes before lecturing me about absolute integrity and black excellence was entirely gone. In his place stood a broken, hollow, empty shell of an old man. Warren stared down at the clumsy, desperate forgery of his wife's signature. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly like a fish suffocating on dry land, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked at the bold red pre-foreclosure notice, confirming that he had less than a month before the predatory bank seized the home he had worked his entire life to secure. He finally comprehended that his perfect biological son, the absolute financial genius he worshipped above all else, had left them entirely and absolutely destitute. Warren slowly raised his heavy head and looked at Jamal, who was currently cowering behind a wooden dining chair to avoid Lauren's hysterical physical attacks. The profound betrayal in Warren's eyes was complete and devastating. He had willingly traded a fiercely loyal stepdaughter who quietly paid his bills for a fraudulent criminal who stole his shelter, and he was just now realizing the astronomical terminal cost of his unearned pride. Sylvia was in an even worse state than her husband. My mother had collapsed back into her padded dining chair, her hands clutching the edges of the white tablecloth to keep herself from sliding onto the marble floor. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, and erratic. She looked around the massive glass room, watching the wealthy elite country club friends she had so desperately tried to impress, actively fleeing toward the garden exits to distance themselves from an impending federal financial scandal. The glamorous high society life she thought she had permanently secured through Jamal's strategic marriage was burning to the ground right in front of her eyes, leaving nothing but ash. She watched the catering staff actively backing away from the screaming match at the front of the room. Sylvia looked down at the shattered remains of her vintage champagne glass on the floor, the sharp crystal shards glittering under the string lights, and then she slowly raised her chin and looked up at me. I stood perfectly still, the quiet, calm eye of the massive hurricane I had intentionally unleashed. I watched my mother process the undeniable fact that I was the only person in this entire grand conservatory who actually held any real tangible power. I was the sole legal creditor. I owned the debt on her physical house. I owned the debt on Jamal's failing investment firm. I even owned the debt on the botanical venue they were currently standing in. I was the only thing standing between her and absolute crushing poverty. Sylvia pushed her chair back, the wood scraping loudly, and took a shaky, stumbling step toward me. The woman who had aggressively grabbed my arm in the kitchen just 24 hours ago, warning me to accept my place in the shadows, was now reaching out to me with trembling, desperate hands. Thick tears streamed continuously down her face, completely ruining the expensive cosmetics she had applied for the foundation portraits she cared so much about. "Kendra, please." Sylvia sobbed, her voice cracking and echoing as she reached across the empty space between us. "You have to stop this right now. You have to fix this. You own the debt. You can cancel the foreclosure process. Please, baby, I am begging you. I know we made terrible mistakes, but you have to save us because you are still my daughter." Sylvia's hand was still outstretched, trembling so violently that the heavy diamond rings on her fingers rattled together. Tears carved wet, erratic tracks through her flawless, expensive foundation, completely ruining the immaculate image she had spent all day crafting for the society photographers. She was begging me to save them, leaning entirely on the biological tether she had gleefully ignored and weaponized for the last 15 years. I looked at her shaking fingers, the very same hands that had grabbed my arm in the kitchen just yesterday to warn me against embarrassing my brother. I simply took a slow, deliberate step backward. The physical distance matched the absolute emotional void in my chest. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the familiar suffocating obligation to fix their manufactured disasters or shoulder the burden of their reckless financial choices. I turned my eyes away from my weeping mother and locked my gaze onto Warren. He was leaning heavily against the white linen of the head table, the forged mortgage document crushed tightly in his massive fist. The arrogant, booming patriarch who had stood at the microphone just 20 minutes ago, lecturing the room about excellence, was entirely gone. In his place stood a terrified, hollow old man staring directly into the absolute ruins of his life. His breathing was shallow and his eyes were wide with the sudden, devastating realization that his biological golden child was nothing more than a predatory criminal. "You told me I would never be half the man he is, Warren," I said. My voice was not loud, but the chilling, absolute clarity of it echoed across the quiet space around the head table, cutting through the sound of Lauren's hysterical sobbing nearby. "You told me I was just pushing boxes while he was building an empire." "You were completely right. I am a woman who actually owns the ground she stands on. You chose to worship a thief because he wore a nice suit and played golf with the right people. Now you get to live in the house he burned down." I did not wait for his response. I did not offer a single word of comfort or forgiveness to the people who had viewed my existence as nothing more than a blue-collar checkbook. I simply turned my back on them. Behind me, the absolute chaos resumed with brutal intensity. Richard was shouting aggressively over the quiet background music, furiously commanding his corporate legal team through his cell phone to freeze Jamal's accounts and contact federal authorities. Lauren was hyperventilating, screaming at the terrified catering staff to stop looking at her while she physically shoved Jamal away from her. I ignored all of it. I walked down the center aisle of the Grand Botanical Conservatory with my head held high and my shoulders pulled back. I did not rush toward the exit. I took my absolute time, letting the satisfying rhythmic click of my heels against the polished marble floor serve as the final ticking clock to their destruction. The wealthy high society guests who had previously looked at me with open disdain now parted like the Red Sea. They hastily pulled their chairs back and dropped their eyes to the floor as I moved past them. They recognized real, unadulterated power when they saw it, and they knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that I held all of it. I walked past the massive melting ice sculptures, carved to look like swans, now dripping sadly onto the decorative floral arrangements. I pushed open the heavy glass double doors of the main entrance and stepped out into the warm, humid Georgia night. The heavy, suffocating floral scent of the venue faded, instantly replaced by the clean, sharp smell of an approaching summer rainstorm. My private driver was waiting by the front steps, standing at attention and holding the rear door to my black SUV open. I slid into the quiet, dark leather interior of the vehicle, breathing out a long, slow sigh of profound relief. The heavy soundproof doors closed, shutting out the distant muffled shouts still echoing from the glass conservatory. As the driver pulled the car smoothly down the sweeping manicured driveway and out through the imposing wrought iron security gates, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently inside my clutch. I pulled the phone out and looked at the glowing bright screen. It was an absolute avalanche of digital desperation. The notifications were rolling in so fast, the device was growing warm in my palm. My mother was calling back to back, leaving frantic weeping voicemails begging me to pick up the phone and talk to her like a daughter. When I did not answer, the text messages began pouring in. "Kendra, please, baby, you have to stop the foreclosure." Sylvia wrote her messages riddled with frantic typos. "You cannot let the bank throw us out. He is your brother. We are your family. Please answer me." Warren sent a block of erratic, aggressive text messages, alternating between demanding, "We sit down like adults to negotiate a repayment plan," and desperately asking for mercy. He was trying to salvage his shattered pride while simultaneously begging his stepdaughter not to leave him homeless. Even Jamal had the sheer, unadulterated audacity to send a message. I watched the text bubble pop up on my screen, reading his panicked, pathetic plea. "Kendra, you cannot do this. We are blood. Lauren is leaving me, and Richard is calling the police. You have the money. You can cover the shortfall. Please do not let me go to federal prison. I will pay you back, I swear to God." I did not read the rest of the messages. I did not listen to a single second of their hysterical voicemails. I methodically opened my contact list and selected Sylvia's name. I stared at the contact profile for a brief second, acknowledging the finality of the action, and then I pressed block. I selected Warren's name and pressed block. I scrolled down to Jamal and Lauren, blocking their phone numbers, their personal emails, their business accounts, and their social media profiles. With a few simple taps on a smooth glass screen, I completely and permanently severed the toxic, heavy anchor I had been dragging behind me for a decade and a half. I cut off their access to my energy, my peace, and my capital. I tossed the silenced phone onto the empty leather seat beside me and leaned my head back against the cool tinted window. The silence inside the car was absolute perfection. I watched the city lights of Atlanta blur past me, feeling lighter than I had ever felt in my entire adult life. But my part in this grand reckoning was not entirely finished. The personal destruction at the botanical estate was complete, but the professional corporate cleanup was just beginning. I had carefully timed the execution of the financial foreclosure on the residential property and the investment firm for Monday morning, but I had prepared a secondary catastrophic strike to ensure Jamal could never manipulate another balance sheet again. Before walking into that vow renewal, I had instructed my corporate legal team to anonymously forward a duplicate copy of the entire financial dossier directly to the Regional Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The dossier contained every forged signature, every illegal wire transfer, and every piece of evidence detailing the massive embezzlement from Richard's private retirement accounts. The wealthy in-laws throwing drinks and screaming about stolen funds at the reception were just the chaotic opening act. The true, inescapable reality of Jamal's criminal actions began the very next morning. While Jamal was likely frantically packing a bag or begging Lauren for forgiveness, a fleet of unmarked dark federal vehicles pulled up to his sleek downtown corporate office building. Federal investigators wearing tactical windbreakers walked straight through the revolving glass doors with active warrants in their hands, bypassing the receptionist and heading directly for his servers. The raid had officially begun. 3 months passed since the federal raid on Jamal's downtown office. The justice system usually grinds forward at a deliberately slow pace, but that rule absolutely does not apply when a financial advisor gets caught stealing from the private retirement accounts of the ultra-wealthy. The fallout from the dossier I anonymously forwarded to the Securities and Exchange Commission was spectacular, absolute, and incredibly public. The local Atlanta news stations ran the story nonstop for weeks, featuring helicopter footage of federal agents carrying dozens of cardboard boxes and seized computer servers out of Jamal's sleek glass corporate building. The golden child of the family was formally indicted on multiple federal charges. The prosecutor laid out a devastating multi-million-dollar case consisting of wire fraud, gross embezzlement, and corporate malfeasance. They denied his bail, citing him as a massive flight risk due to his offshore accounts. The arrogant man who had stood at a microphone boasting about his flawless integrity and unmatched business acumen was now sitting in a federal holding cell wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit. His entire fabricated empire had evaporated overnight, leaving him with absolutely nothing but a looming prison sentence and a public defender. Lauren did not stand by her man. The moment the federal agents froze their joint bank accounts, the fragile suburban princess immediately filed for a highly publicized and incredibly bitter divorce. She hired a team of vicious, ruthless attorneys, desperate to distance herself from his mounting list of federal crimes. She tried to launch a massive public relations campaign framing herself as the ultimate naive victim who had been completely manipulated by a predatory husband. She gave tearful interviews claiming she had absolutely no idea how her lavish lifestyle was being funded. But the court of public opinion was entirely unforgiving. Social media investigators pulled up her old, arrogant posts where she bragged about her unbothered generational wealth and her diamond tennis bracelets. Her own wealthy social circle immediately excommunicated her, treating her like an absolute pariah. Her father faced massive humiliation at his precious Buckhead Country Club, having to publicly admit his son-in-law had embezzled his retirement funds. Lauren lost her luxury vehicles, her designer wardrobe, and her entire societal standing. She was forced to move back into her parents' basement, her pristine reputation permanently and irrevocably ruined. While Jamal and Lauren tore each other apart in the public eye, the quiet, inescapable reality of my legal maneuvers finally closed in on Warren and Sylvia. The foreclosure proceedings I had initiated on their residential property moved forward with flawless mechanical precision. Because Jamal had fraudulently extracted every single drop of equity out of the house, there was absolutely nothing left for them to negotiate. They had no capital to hire a defense attorney and no legal ground to stand on. 30 days after the spectacular disaster of the botanical vow renewal, the county sheriff's department arrived at their suburban estate with the final official eviction notice. I did not go to watch them pack their boxes. I had no desire to revel in the physical reality of their displacement. But my legal team provided me with the standard updates detailing the completion of the asset seizure. Warren and Sylvia were forced to load whatever belongings they could fit into a rented moving truck and leave the sprawling home they had prized above all else. Unable to secure a new lease anywhere near their old affluent neighborhood due to their destroyed credit scores, they were forced to downsize drastically. They relocated to a cramped, rundown two-bedroom apartment on the absolute furthest outskirts of the city. The expansive manicured lawns and the quiet security of their gated community were replaced by the harsh reality of a noisy, neglected complex surrounded by industrial strip malls. Warren, the man who had loudly mocked my logistics facility as a place for simple manual labor, was now forced to look for an entry-level retail management job just to keep the lights on. The realization that his unearned pride had literally bought him poverty was a heavy, suffocating weight he would have to carry for the rest of his life. I focused entirely on my company. The municipal shipping contract we had secured transformed my logistics firm into an absolute powerhouse. I was busy hiring new regional directors, expanding my commercial fleet, and scouting locations for a second major distribution warehouse. My life was a vibrant, busy symphony of massive corporate growth and genuine fulfillment. The toxic anchor I had dragged behind me for 15 years was completely gone, and the resulting surge of energy felt incredible. But toxic people rarely accept boundaries without attempting one final desperate manipulation. It was a rainy Tuesday morning exactly 3 months after I had walked out of the glass conservatory. I was sitting at my heavy oak desk reviewing the architectural blueprints for our new warehouse expansion. The intercom on my desk phone buzzed sharply, cutting through the quiet focus of my office. "Kendra, my head of security." Terrence said, his deep voice coming through the speaker with a tight edge of professional caution. "We have a situation down here in the main lobby. Your mother is here." I set my pen down on the blueprints. The rain beat a steady rhythm against my floor-to-ceiling windows. Has she breached the security gates? I asked, keeping my voice completely level. No, Terrence replied. She walked into the front reception area. She does not have an appointment and she is highly agitated. She is begging the front desk staff to let her up to the executive floor. She keeps saying she made a massive mistake and she just wants her family back. I can have my team physically escort her off the property right now if you want to give the word. I turned my leather chair toward the bank of security monitors mounted on the wall to my left. I typed in the access code and pulled up the live camera feed for the main reception lobby. The high-definition camera showed Sylvia standing in front of the curved marble reception desk. The stylish, affluent woman who had confidently grabbed my arm in the catering kitchen to demand my silence was entirely gone. She looked exhausted, fragile, and profoundly desperate. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and she was wearing a simple faded raincoat that looked entirely out of place in my sleek corporate headquarters. She was clutching her purse against her chest, physically leaning over the desk as she pleaded with my receptionist. Even without audio, I could read the frantic, desperate energy in her body language. She was crying, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, hoping to leverage maternal guilt to bypass my security protocols. She had finally hit rock bottom in her cramped, run-down apartment and realized the golden child she had protected at all costs was locked in a federal cell. She was coming to the daughter she had completely discarded, hoping my checkbook was still open, hoping I would save her from the horrific consequences of her own deliberate choices. "Hold your position, Terrence," I said, leaning closer to the microphone on my desk. "I am not coming down to the lobby, and she is absolutely not coming up to this floor. But I have one thing I need you to deliver to her before you remove her from the building." I opened a blank document on my computer screen. I did not need to think about the words. They were permanently burned into my memory, perfectly preserved from the exact moment the final thread of my familial loyalty had completely snapped. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing the exact quote with flawless precision. I highlighted the text, increased the font size so it filled the center of the page, and hit print. The laser printer on the corner of my desk hummed quietly, producing the single crisp white sheet of paper. I picked it up, checking the bold black ink. "David," I called out, knowing my director of operations was working in the adjacent office. David walked in holding a coffee mug, his eyes questioning. "Take this down to Terrence in the main lobby," I instructed, handing him the single sheet of paper. "Tell Terrence to hand this directly to the woman crying at the reception desk. Do not say a single word to her. Just hand her the paper and then walk her out the front doors." David looked down at the paper, reading the text. A small, knowing smile touched the corners of his mouth. He nodded, immediately turned around and headed straight for the elevator bank. I turned my attention back to the security monitors, watching the live feed unfold. I saw the elevator doors open in the lobby. David stepped out and handed the folded piece of paper to Terrence. Terrence, a towering wall of absolute military discipline, walked over to where Sylvia was frantically pleading with the receptionist. Sylvia looked up at the massive security director, her face lighting up with a sudden, desperate flash of hope. She reached out, assuming the paper was a visitor pass or a message inviting her up to my suite. Terrence placed the crisp white paper directly into her trembling hands. I watched through the digital feed as my mother unfolded the page. I watched her eyes dart across the bold black text, reading the exact words Warren had proudly announced to a crowded steakhouse just a few short months ago. "You will never be half the man your stepbrother is, Kendra. You are 35 and still playing around with trucks and boxes." Sylvia stared at the paper, and the last remaining ounce of color drained completely from her face. Her shoulders slumped forward, as if an invisible crushing weight had just been dropped directly onto her spine. The absolute finality of the message hit her with devastating clarity. There would be no tearful reunion. There would be no financial rescue. The bridge was not just burned, it was entirely eradicated. Terrence gestured firmly toward the heavy glass exit doors. Sylvia did not argue. She did not raise her voice or attempt to fight the security director. She slowly folded the piece of paper, clutching it tightly against her chest like a physical wound. She turned around, her head hanging low, and walked out of the glass double doors, stepping back out into the cold gray rain. I watched her small, fragile figure disappear from the camera feed, entirely swallowed by the bustling traffic of the industrial park. I reached out and tapped a button on my keyboard, turning the security monitors off. The screens went perfectly black, reflecting the quiet, calm control of my executive office. I picked up my pen, pulled the architectural blueprints for my new facility back into the center of my desk, and went right back to work. 6 months passed since that rainy Tuesday morning when Sylvia walked out of my corporate lobby clutching the printed proof of her own husband's cruelty. Half a year can feel like an entire lifetime when you finally drop the heavy toxic dead weight you have been dragging behind you for 15 years. I stood in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my newly upgraded corporate headquarters, letting the warm, bright Georgia sunlight wash over my face. The municipal shipping contract had not just grown my business, it had completely transformed my logistics firm into an untouchable regional powerhouse. We did not just expand, we absolutely dominated the entire southeastern commercial corridor. In just 6 months, I had opened 3 new massive distribution centers, hired 400 additional skilled employees, and completely upgraded my commercial fleet with top-of-the-line, eco-friendly transport vehicles. I watched the organized ballet of massive 18-wheelers pulling in and out of the loading bays far below my executive office. The rhythmic rumbling hum of heavy diesel engines and the sharp hydraulic hiss of air brakes felt like the steady, powerful heartbeat of an empire I had built entirely with my own 2 bare hands. Warren had loudly and publicly called this playing around with trucks and boxes. I thought my blue-collar grit was something to be deeply ashamed of because it did not come with a pretentious country club membership or a fake executive job title funded by stolen equity. But standing here looking out over a sprawling facility that generated tens of millions of dollars in legitimate, untainted revenue, I knew the absolute, undeniable truth. There is absolutely no shame in building your wealth from the ground up with sweat and sacrifice. The only true shame lies in stealing from the very people who love you, just to pretend you are something you are not. I turned away from the vast window and smoothed the premium fabric of my tailored suit. It was time to leave the office for the day. I had a very important dinner to host, and for the first time in my entire adult life, I was actually looking forward to sitting at the head of the table. I drove my sleek black SUV away from the busy industrial park, heading directly toward the affluent, quiet waterfront district where I had recently purchased my new home. It was a sprawling, spectacular modern estate with wide-open living spaces, high vaulted ceilings, and massive glass doors that opened directly onto a beautiful private dock. But unlike the suffocating, overly decorated suburban mansion my parents had tragically lost to foreclosure, this house was not designed to impress wealthy strangers or project a fake, fragile image of generational wealth. This house was designed purely for peace. That evening, the warm summer air was filled with the rich, mouth-watering, savory scent of catered soul food and the loud, unapologetic sound of genuine, joyous laughter. I was hosting a private dinner party on my expansive stone back patio, overlooking the calm, dark, reflective water of the lake. I looked around the long, heavy wooden dining table, taking in the bright, smiling faces of the incredible people seated there. This was my chosen family. These were the loyal people who had celebrated my exhausting blue-collar grind just as fiercely as they now celebrated my massive executive success. David, my brilliant director of operations, was sitting at the far end of the table, telling a hilarious animated story about a chaotic routing mix-up that had everyone in absolute stitches. Terrence, my towering head of security, was laughing so hard he had to set down his plate of barbecue ribs, wiping tears of mirth from his eyes. Next to him sat my early business mentors, the rough, tough older black men and women who had owned the local freight yards and taught me how to fiercely negotiate my first commercial lease when I was just a desperate girl trying to survive a harsh world. There were absolutely no blood relatives sitting at this table. There was no one who viewed my existence as a simple financial transaction. There was no one waiting for me to pull out my corporate checkbook to cover their manufactured emergencies or fund their fraudulent lifestyles. Nobody here was aggressively grading my performance, constantly comparing me to a criminal golden child, or demanding that I shrink my own success to make them feel bigger. The energy on the patio was vibrant, joyous, and completely unburdened by toxic familial expectations. I watched my friends pass heavy plates of warm food and pour tall glasses of expensive wine, completely overwhelmed by the sheer beautiful reality of reciprocal love. This was what family was actually supposed to feel like. It was not a heavy, suffocating chain of obligation. It was a solid, unbreakable foundation of absolute, unwavering support. I quietly stepped away from the lively, engaging conversation at the dining table and walked slowly down the wooden steps toward the very edge of the private dock. The cool water lapped gently against the sturdy wooden pilings, creating a soothing, rhythmic sound that anchored my spirit to the present moment. I stood there looking out over the dark, reflective surface of the quiet lake. It felt remarkably similar to the way I used to stand on the elevated steel catwalks, looking out over the concrete floors of my loading docks. The environment had certainly upgraded to extreme luxury, but the strong, resilient woman standing there remained exactly the same. I searched my heart deeply, expecting to find some lingering trace of hot anger or heavy resentment toward Warren, Sylvia, and Jamal. I had spent 15 years harboring a deep, painful, agonizing bitterness over their constant, blatant rejection and their brutal financial exploitation. But as I stood there under the clear, bright night sky, I realized the bitterness was entirely and completely gone. It had evaporated into thin air the exact moment I finally stopped trying to force toxic people to love me. There was absolutely no anger left inside my chest. There was only a profound, absolute sense of deep, enduring peace. I had finally accepted the hardest, most painful truth of my entire life. You simply cannot buy respect from people who are fiercely committed to misunderstanding your worth. My biological family had looked at my relentless hard work and seen only a convenient resource to be drained dry. They had looked at my deep loyalty and seen only a pathetic weakness to be exploited for their own gain. I had spent my entire adult life desperately trying to buy a secure seat at their table, hoping that if I just paid enough bills and solved enough problems, they would finally pull out a chair and welcome me. But walking away from their table at that high-end steakhouse was the absolute best decision I ever made in my life. It was the only way I was ever going to build a table of my own. Kendra, a warm, familiar voice, called out, breaking through my quiet, peaceful reflection. I turned around to see David standing at the top of the wooden steps, holding two crystal glasses of expensive vintage champagne. "We are getting ready to make a toast, boss," he said, a wide, genuine smile lighting up his face under the patio string lights. "We absolutely cannot do it without the woman of the hour." I smiled back, a deep, authentic expression of pure joy that reached all the way to my eyes. "I am coming, David," I replied, walking back up the wooden stairs to join the wonderful people who actually mattered to me. I took the cool crystal champagne flute from his hand and walked proudly back to the head of the long dining table. The lively, loud chatter died down, immediately replaced by a warm, highly respectful silence as my chosen family turned their full attention to me. They raised their glasses high, waiting eagerly for me to speak. I looked at the incredible, supportive faces surrounding me, feeling the absolute weightless freedom of a life lived entirely on my own terms. My logistics business was thriving far beyond my wildest initial expectations. My bank accounts were permanently secure. But much more importantly, my spirit was entirely whole and unbroken. They had tried so hard to crush me, to steal from me, and to relegate me to the dark shadows of their fraudulent lives. But I had taken every single heavy brick they threw at me and used it to build an untouchable, magnificent empire. "To beautiful new beginnings," I said, projecting my voice and raising my glass high into the warm summer night air. "And to the incredible family we choose for ourselves." The entire table erupted in loud, joyous cheers, and the melodic, ringing clink of crystal glasses, meeting in celebration. I took a slow, highly satisfying sip of my cold champagne, feeling perfectly content in my own skin. I was finally completely and utterly free. Have you ever had to bravely walk away from a toxic family table to finally build a beautiful one of your own? I would absolutely love to hear your inspiring story of finding your chosen family in the comments section below. If my personal journey to ultimate freedom resonated with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about reclaiming your worth and building your own empire. Remember, your true value is never determined by the blind people who refuse to see it. Thank you for listening to my story, and never be afraid to proudly own the ground you stand on. Never let other people define your worth. The greatest lesson from Kendra's story is that your value does not decrease just because someone refuses to recognize it. Sometimes the people closest to us can become the ones who misunderstand us the most. They may judge our choices, underestimate our abilities, or compare us to someone else because they only see the surface of our journey. But someone's opinion of you does not determine your true worth. For years, Kendra allowed her family's perception of her to influence how she saw herself. They looked at her logistics company and saw only trucks, warehouses, and manual labor. They never saw the late nights, the sacrifices, the risks, and the determination required to build something from nothing. They compared her to Jamal because they believed traditional success was measured by status, appearance, and social approval. They never took the time to understand the strength, intelligence, and discipline behind her achievements. This story reminds us that success does not always look the way people expect. Some people build their futures quietly. They work when nobody is watching. They struggle without asking for recognition. They sacrifice their comfort so others can survive. And often the same people who underestimate them today are the ones who are shocked when the truth finally comes out. Another important lesson is the danger of seeking validation from people who have already decided to misunderstand you. Kendra spent years trying to prove herself to people who had no intention of appreciating her. She gave her time, money, and energy to protect her family, hoping that one day they would finally see her efforts. Instead, they accepted her sacrifices while continuing to disrespect her. This teaches us that kindness should never require us to abandon our own dignity. Helping others is a beautiful act, but allowing people to take advantage of our generosity only creates resentment and pain. Healthy relationships require respect, honesty, and gratitude. When those things disappear, boundaries become necessary. The story also teaches the importance of protecting what you build. Kendra did not become successful by accident. She created her company through years of discipline, learning, and persistence. But she also learned that protecting her success was just as important as creating it. Trust is valuable, but trust without accountability can become dangerous. Jamal's downfall was not caused by a lack of opportunity. He had intelligence, resources, and support. His failure came from choosing deception over integrity. He wanted the image of success without the responsibility and discipline required to achieve real success. He built his reputation on lies, and eventually those lies collapsed under the weight of the truth. True success is not about appearing powerful. It is about having character when nobody is watching. Money, titles, and social status can create an impressive image, but integrity is what creates a lasting legacy. Kendra's journey also shows that silence does not mean weakness. For many years, she stayed quiet because she valued peace and family. But when she finally spoke, she did not need anger or revenge to prove herself. She simply revealed the truth. Facts, preparation, and confidence became her strongest weapons. Sometimes people mistake patience for weakness. They believe that because someone does not fight back immediately, they can continue taking advantage of them. But patience has a limit. There comes a moment when protecting your peace becomes more important than maintaining someone else's illusion. The final lesson is this: never allow anyone to make you feel small, because they cannot understand your greatness. Your journey may look different from theirs. Your achievements may not fit their definition of success. But if you are working hard, staying honest, and building something meaningful, your worth already exists. The people who truly matter will celebrate your growth instead of competing with it. They will appreciate your sacrifices instead of exploiting them. And they will respect you not because of what you can provide, but because of who you are. Sometimes the greatest victory is not proving others wrong. It is finally realizing that you never needed their approval in the first place. If Kendra's story inspired you, remember that your worth is never decided by people who fail to see your value. Share this story with someone who needs encouragement. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more powerful stories about courage, resilience, and overcoming betrayal.